We're doing it live. I've done 6 hours of the StarCraft today, and I'm going to do a little bit more now. Nice and easy with codename Agent Smith. Anyone who's here in the chat, you can ask questions. Just put them in the chat direct toward Agent Smith, and if they're reasonable and good questions that focus on his knowledge and expertise, then Packed Facts will pass them along, and you can be part of the conversation. But to intro this week, what happened? What did we miss? Us who play video games all day and don't read the news.
Well, that G20 meeting happened. That was probably the big thing. That went off about as well as was expected.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, mostly Donald Trump did not get into too much trouble. So that's pretty much about as good an outcome as we here in the United States were hoping for.
To lead people in, some people are asking, what is G20? If they don't know.
The G20 is it means a group of 20 nations, and it basically includes all of the developed nations and their leaders, and then the leaders from sundry other leading developed countries, or developing countries rather. So the leadership of India is there, China is there, Indonesia, South Africa, Brazil, and then as well as the major developed economies. Angela Merkel from Germany, Emmanuel Macron from France, obviously the United States, Justin Trudeau from Canada, etc., etc. So they were all there, and the meeting is held, I think, about once a year. And it's just a forum where they can all discuss significant issues.
Mm-hmm.
And this go around, they talked about mostly international trade and then the Paris Agreement that Donald Trump decided to pull out of. And generally at the end of these meetings, there's kind of a general statement that all of the leaders sign on to kind of present to the world a common front regarding certain issues, what the position is, and to kind of set guidelines going forward for the global community as far as certain issues go. And pretty watered down this time. Everybody was pretty gung-ho about the Paris Agreement and sticking with that. But then, of course, the United States kind of had its own byline type thing where it was kind of, yeah, we're not going to do that, though. And then there was some talk about, what was the other thing? Oh, right. The other thing that Trump got was everybody agreed to put into the final statement that countries have a right to protect their markets.
Mm-hmm.
So that was seen as Trump sort of injecting his protectionist impulses, influencing the meeting that way. I doubt it's not like as much as he would have wanted, probably. He probably wanted something tighter that involved full protectionism, an endorsement of protectionist policy, but that didn't happen. Instead, it was just, in general, the statement was basically said that in general, under certain circumstances, there are mechanisms that countries can use to protect their markets, which is a very sort of benign, generic statement that kind of is a sort of long-winded way to say nothing.
It's broad enough and vague enough that it was hard for other people to disagree with it.
Yeah, exactly. So, other than that, not a lot going on. Trump met with Vladimir Putin for the first time. The media was very excited about that. I don't know that there was much going on there. The only thing I noticed, or at least that was noticeable in terms of policy outcomes thus far from his meeting with Putin, was a ceasefire in southern Syria. The United States has a lot of influence with Kurds, but it also has a lot of influence with rebel groups in the southern part of Syria, where it kind of works with them in conjunction with the Jordanian government and probably also the Saudi government. And I think it was during the G20 agreement it was announced there would be a general ceasefire between southern rebel groups and the Syrian government, and that's probably connected somehow to Putin, I would guess, to the Putin-Trump talks. At the same time, the United States is still supporting Kurds in eastern Syria, which are still pushing on Raqqa, a big city over there. And how they're going to interact with the Syrian government going forward, that's a little more open-ended, that's a little more unclear. But I think the southern ceasefire was low-hanging fruit, because they already kind of had a ceasefire. Southern Syria has been a very quiet front in the Syrian civil war for a long time now. So, not a big change, but that was the most significant thing out of that. Yeah, not a whole lot else going on there, I don't think. I'm sure that Trump tried to push kind of some of his policy preferences, but most of the leaders there are pretty relatively liberal. So he probably met a lot of resistance from the leading actors at the G20. I do remember one thing I read was that he snuck off during a meeting on energy and the environment, I think it was, to go and have a bilateral talk with the leader of Indonesia, which, well, it was either the leader of Indonesia or it was his representative. Just come to think of it, I don't think it was Widodo. Yeah, but regardless, he met with some government official from Indonesia, and he left his daughter, Ivanka Trump, in his place during the G20 meeting, the general G20 meeting, during this designated period when they were all supposed to be talking about energy and the environment. So that was kind of seen as a signal that the U.S. government doesn't care much for that topic.
But there were no fistfights or anything, so it mostly went kind of as people would have expected.
Yeah, no shocks. Nothing dramatic really happened, so should be thankful for that anyway. You know, I was thinking about a question you asked last week. It was about Nigeria. You were asking me that you were talking about how it's going to be a big regional player. And then you asked me if I'd heard anything about that, and then I kind of misinterpreted the question and started talking about what I'd heard in the news recently. I tried to think of what I had heard about it, rather than kind of addressing that specific part of your question. And so, to kind of return to that, yes, Nigeria will be a regional power going forward, and it will probably interact more with its neighbors, exponentially more going in the future, just because its economy and demography is so much, gives it so much power relative to its neighbors. And something I didn't think of then that I wished I'd had was an organization called ECOWAS, which stands for Economic Community of West African States. And that's an international group that it does two things. Primarily, it's intended to create a sort of West African single market, kind of like the European Union. It wants to reduce tariffs and encourage free trade between countries in West Africa, which they need because there's not nearly as much trade as there should be. You know, it's kind of one natural economy. It's a natural single market. Given that they're all right next to each other and all of the countries there are very small, it makes sense that it does not make a lot of sense for them to try to put up barriers. You know, they're not really large enough countries generally to propagate, you know, development in and of themselves, by themselves. ECOWAS kind of tries to address that by encouraging everybody to lower tariffs and ease other non-tariff barriers to trade. And then it's also becoming a political organization. They're kind of working on having like an ECOWAS parliament and trying to create certain rules and regulations for when countries can intervene in each other's affairs, what certain actions are kind of beyond the pale, like leaders not ceding power after an election. That's kind of a no-no in ECOWAS. So when leaders have done that over the past 5 to 10 years, generally it's ECOWAS troops that stage the subsequent intervention. Generally with French help. France is a pretty big player in West Africa. We could talk about that sometime because that's pretty interesting. But ECOWAS is kind of a big thing in West Africa right now. It's going to be a big part of the region's development and politics going forward. And Nigeria is easily the most powerful country in ECOWAS. So that could, ECOWAS could then be a sort of venue for exerting Nigerian power in the region and be the way that they exert their preferences, economic and political preferences on their neighbors going forward. So that's an example of how Nigeria's power will increasingly influence the region. Yeah, so that's a much better answer to your question last week.
Awesome. Well, and it kind of fits the general progression of as a nation develops itself, it kind of begins to expand outward and exert some influence there. So that's basically the manifestation of that process of them making enough progress that they can start to be a bigger player just in the nearby area. We think that this is important.
So somebody asked, what parallels do you see between the U.S. pulling out of the Paris Agreement now and when they pulled out of the Kyoto Protocol in the late 90s? Pretty similar. I mean, here's the thing. I don't know as much about the Kyoto Protocol, but I think it's similar to the Paris Agreement in the sense that if the countries that signed on to it had failed to live up to their promises in the agreement, there would have been no repercussions. It's not like there was any kind of punishment that anybody could really put on a country that just flagrantly flouts their commitments in that treaty. And that's actually why Nicaragua never signed the Paris Agreement. The Nicaraguan government said that without any kind of, enforcement mechanism, that it was just pointless. It was just words. Countries either would or would not commit to it and actually adhere to the agreement. So the United States pulling out of the agreement probably isn't that meaningful, since it really wasn't doing much to pursue the agreement's prerogative, the actions outlined in the agreement in the first place. So pulling out of it or being in of it isn't that different if you're still doing the same thing. And the United States is probably doing about as much now after it left the agreement in pursuit of the agreement's goals that it was doing before when it was still in the agreement. So not a big change, and the Kyoto Protocol is the same. I mean, what was the United States really doing to actually implement the Kyoto Protocol before it left the Kyoto? Probably not much. So it's more of a symbolic thing. And really climate agreements like Paris and Kyoto, those are mostly symbolic agreements in the first place. In fact, when the Paris Agreement was being negotiated, one of the stumbling blocks was that the United States government specifically refused to sign an agreement that did have enforcement mechanisms because it did not want to be a part of an agreement that would infringe on its sovereignty. So, I mean, right from the get-go, these treaties generally just don't have any meat to them. It's nice, it shows commitment to a global issue, but in general, not a lot of impact in the long run, unless the countries that sign it were already going to do that. There's enough political pressure and enough support in a lot of countries that they were going to do those things anyway, regardless of whether or not they're part of a single treaty. So, I mean, somebody more familiar with the history of environmental agreements like that maybe could flesh out the degree to which countries kind of change their behavior after signing such agreements. But in the American case, I haven't seen significant change, and I don't think it's like substantive. Again, being mostly symbolic, it was mostly symbolic leaving it. It was a political action to sign the agreement in the first place, just showing that, yes, we care about this issue, and then leaving it also mostly political. It was kind of throwing red meat to his base. Donald Trump trying to appeal to people for whom environmental issues are not important, and people in industries, specifically in the United States, who see such agreements as detrimental to their interests. That was leaving the agreement more plays to them and tries to kind of pander to them, rather than kind of suggesting a significant change in policy.
Gotta pander to your base.
Oh yeah, especially here in the U.S.
Well, we used the sports team analogy before, and it's very much kind of understanding the interests of your team and how to keep them riled up, just so you can get more stuff done and build momentum, as opposed to let your opponents build momentum.
Yeah.
And we've talked about the opportunistic approach of not necessarily being the primary driver of those moments, but just pointing out anything that kind of fits into that narrative and being like, ha, look at the progress we've made on our fronts. We're the best. I told you so.
Yeah, and in climate accords, it's just, France, Britain, Europe, Japan, a lot of those places were going to implement those goals regardless. So, yeah, pandering is definitely a big part of that, I think. Somebody asked, is the goal of ECOWAS to become similar to the EU in function and structure? I don't know if they want to become exactly like the EU. I don't know the degree to which they want to go in that direction, but in general, that is where they're going. They do want more political unification. Certainly, they want a lot of economic unification. I think in so much as the European Union is an economic institution, I think they definitely want ECOWAS to become something like that. I don't think they'll go so far in the political side in terms of creating a kind of moving exponentially towards a federalized institution. That's kind of where the EU is. European member states kind of intended the EU from the start to kind of slowly move towards a federalized model, and that's kind of meeting resistance now. But I don't think ECOWAS will go that direction because a lot of countries in West Africa do value their sovereignty a lot and probably are going to be much less willing to make trade-offs in that regard in ECOWAS. So in terms of economic issues, yes, more like the EU, but in terms of political unification, probably not. So to some degree, yes, but not nearly to the same degree as the European Union. How much of forums like G20 are meant to come up with productive solutions as opposed to keeping up appearances, i.e. political posturing? They're not really meant for any particular outcome, I think. It's more meant as an opportunity. So regardless of whether or not they're just used as sort of a stage for kabuki theater, or if they're used actually to try to pursue solutions and try to contrive some, regardless, it's an opportunity in which maybe whatever solutions are agreed would not have been agreed to without the venue. So G20 and forums like G20, as you say, is again, it's just meant to give people an opportunity to do that. Because in general, leaders are very busy. They're generally mostly busy with domestic politics. They don't always have a chance to just kind of go out and have a meeting about general international issues that aren't particularly pressing at a time. A lot of being a leader of a country is crisis management. So it can be hard to kind of pick time out of your schedule that's good for a meeting like that. So the G20 and other such institutions, that just gives leaders a chance to kind of get together and talk where otherwise they might not have bothered or might not have had time for it. It's just something you can put on your schedule well in advance and plan around. So I thought this was pretty interesting. There was the Trump administration is doing a national security review of steel imports, which is apparently a thing they can do.
Why steel?
It's an old, huh?
Why steel?
Why steel? Because one of the big issues in international trade over the past 10 years has been Chinese dumping of steel. Mm-hmm. And dumping is this very sort of ambiguous concept in the international trade literature that refers to a country purposely trying to sell a given product under the price of production in order to push producers in other countries out of business. Mm. And the idea is to make them leave the market so that you can dominate that market, so you can take their market share. And on paper, that's pretty clear cut, but in practice, it's kind of difficult to prove. In China, they have a lot of state-owned industries, and they have policies that induce, the government can bring a lot of pressure on banks to lend to certain industries. And so the combined effect of all that is that it's kind of cheaper to produce, and it's possible to actually produce under cost for a long period of time if you're a targeted industry like that. And that's what they did with steel, especially after the big economic downturn after 2008. Chinese government really doubled down on investment to try to make up for the fall in exports. And one of the ways they did that was by just dumping money into the steel industry. And that preserved a lot of jobs in the steel industry and also added jobs to the steel industry. But then it also meant there was a big glut in steel. It distorted the market. So there ended up being a lot more steel on the market than there needed to be. And the result was that prices fell significantly. And so European and American steel producers have complained quite a bit over the past few years about the detrimental effects of this sort of below-cost Chinese steel competition. And for a long time, it wasn't like a big deal because a lot of people didn't want to start shit with the Chinese government over it. It was kind of seen as a pretty marginal issue. The United States and Europe don't really import a whole lot of steel from China, so it wasn't seen as like a deal breaker. It wasn't seen like something that you would sacrifice other issues for. But the Trump administration kind of made the steel industry a central plank of his political platform, mostly for symbolic reasons, I think. I think a lot of a lot of people intuitively think of the steel industry as being a sort of benchmark for how strong your nation's industry is. And so if your nation's steel industry is suffering, well, that must mean the whole nation's industry in general must be suffering. So Trump kind of emphasized the steel industry, and he's been pushing China to kind of do more about supposed dumping. And the National Security Review is the most recent thing, and apparently this is an established law. An administration can review whether or not economic trends or something like, steel dumping has a detrimental effect on the nation's national security, and if so, that gives the administration special rights to retaliate. And so the Trump administration's kind of argument, what they're looking for is whether or not the Chinese are trying to either destroy or substantially cripple the American steel industry, such that if there were an emergency, if there were some kind of war or conflict in which Chinese steel imports were cut off from the United States, if that were the case, then the United States might be in a position where it could not buy steel, if indeed Chinese producers did somehow take over the market with dumping over the long term. So they're kind of looking for proof of that so that they can implement tariffs in the steel industry against imports. And that's a problem because they're not just looking at exacting steel tariffs against Chinese steel. If they put the tariffs in place the way they're talking about it, they would be putting tariffs in place against all steel imports from every steel producer. And so that has people kind of chatting about the possibility of a trade war, because already the Chinese and the Europeans have said that if tariffs are implemented like that, they would retaliate. There would be retaliatory tariffs. And they've already hinted that they would target their tariffs. One of the neat things in the international trade literature over the past 20 years is looking at the political economy of tariffs. Like if there's a country that's putting tariffs on you or doing something you don't like, you can design tariffs against specific parts of their economy that pressure parts of their country that are politically sensitive. So the core of Trump's support is sort of in the Midwest.
Yeah.
And so they're talking about targeting tariffs on industries in the Midwest, specifically industry and agriculture. And those are the industries dominant in the areas that kind of voted for Trump. So they can actually target tariffs that specifically impact those industries and therefore impact his voters, and would therefore really put a lot of political pressure on Trump to kind of ease off, if not abandon tariffs generally.
Interesting. How crucial do you think the steel industry is moving forward, as we're talking about countries advancing and moving on to different types of industry, AI and renewable energy and all that?
Steel used to be a lot more important. Like way back in the mid-20th century, that was kind of its heyday, because steel was used in just about everything. Most industrial processes use steel in some fashion. And so a country's development generally involved the consumption of steel, and because of that, a lot of development models in that period emphasized a country creating its own steel industry so that it could provide its own steel, so it wouldn't have to import it. Since then, steel has gotten a lot less important. Partly that's because it doesn't employ nearly as many people. Before you could employ a lot of people and use the consumption from the workers as, part of the push that helped to create demand, helped create a more modern economy. Now, because fewer people are employed, it's not as important. And because industries that use steel are relatively less important to national economies, it's not seen as essential to have your own steel industry. Mm-hmm. So it's not nearly as important now. And really, the United States steel industry is not that bad off. What really happened is that foreign producers could generally produce steel cheaper. And so American steel producers, instead of just going under or just being crushed by competition, what they did is they specialized in high-end steel, premium steel. Foreign steel makers could produce cheaper, so they generally took up most of the market for like cheap steel. But because the United States had more it had more experience making steel, it had better technology, more access to human capital, it was able to invest in the production of very high-end quality steel, like for very specialized projects. I don't know enough about steel and construction to know how different types of steel are used, but I know that the steel sold in the United States focuses on the up end of part of the market. So it's still pretty strong. It still exports a lot and makes a lot. It probably doesn't make as much as it used to, and it doesn't have nearly as much market share as it used to, certainly. but it's relatively healthy. You know, their problem is just dumping. You know, that's their principal gripe. But beyond that, they're not really that bad off, as far as I know, anyway. Let's see. So here's a new question. How will state-run industries in, say, China fare in the event of a recession in the Chinese economy? How will this affect global markets beyond a standard recession of the Chinese economy? State-run industries in the event of a recession probably will not do very badly because state-run industries are very politically sensitive in China. Like the Chinese government really goes out of its way to make sure employment in those industries does not dip too much. If it, over time it's been falling. Employment in state-owned industries over time in China is falling, but it's a slow drip. It's not like substantial, because the Chinese government is afraid that if there's just mass layoffs in these industries, that so many people will be unemployed that they'll be angry. They'll be upset with the party, and then that could represent a political threat. That could introduce a lot of instability. So the government generally takes care of its state-owned enterprises, and that's the case regardless of whether or not there's a downturn or not. In fact, they're more likely to support them in the event of a downturn in order to kind of counteract the effects of the private sector laying off workers, to kind of act as a counter-cyclical effect on that. So they would probably do fine in the event of a recession. I think a more interesting question is how they do in general, and in general they're very inefficient and they don't make much money. In fact, a lot of state-owned industries in China lose a lot of money, and it actually costs the government a lot of money to keep them running. So one of the big pushes in the reform era of China, starting around after 1980, was to kind of pare down the size of state-owned industries and try to introduce market competition by opening up the economy. One of the positive effects of that is that it forced state-owned industries to be more competitive. Since before they just didn't have any competition really. But with the introduction of private sector competition, they had to kind of up their game a little bit and be more efficient and introduce new capital and investment and whatnot. They're still not very good relative to the private sector and private sector producers, and they get heavily subsidized by the government still, but they're not as bad as they used to be. I think the long-term goal for the Chinese government is to kind of get rid of them completely if possible, because they are just a big drain on resources. And the people inside them are politically powerful in their own right, because they're kind of seen as a bulwark, right? They employ so many people that it's seen as a way that the Communist Party maintains its popularity, legitimacy. The party can say that, oh, look at all these jobs we help provide. So the people in the party who are responsible for running these industries are generally politically powerful within the party. And actually one of the big things that Xi Jinping has done since he's been in power, he's like the premier of China right now, he's kind of gone after state-owned industries, especially the oil sector. There was a major political battle in China after Xi Jinping got into power between himself, his supporters, and against the state-owned oil industry, as well as their allies. And they basically, a lot of the stuff you hear about anti-corruption in China and the big anti-corruption drive, a lot of that was originally kind of a way for Xi Jinping to go after political rivals in the state oil industry. And all of those guys, even really high-level guys, kind of got thrown out, which is really unusual in China, at least in the reform era. So that was an example of how politically powerful these state-owned enterprises can be. And yeah, they're just not very efficient, but it's really hard to wind them down because they are politically powerful and because they do kind of give the party a certain amount of legitimacy. How will this affect global markets? Okay, so how will state-run industries handle a recession, and how will that affect global markets? I don't think state-run enterprises in China are really that important in terms of the overall Chinese economy. So if they were to experience a downturn, if there were a downturn in the Chinese economy, that would affect global markets a lot. But whether state-run enterprises get wound down completely, or if they're expanded or whatever, that's not going to affect global markets a whole lot. If you're asking how a Chinese recession in general will affect the global market economy, that'll have a big effect, because a lot of international corporations derive a good chunk of their profits from China. Even if their presence in China isn't that great, a lot of their profits come there because they can sell so many items at a premium. It's very hard to compete in China, though. But how the level of competition and the problems that foreign companies face in the Chinese market, that's a whole other discussion. We could get into that if somebody wants to, but in general, yeah, the Chinese market is very influential. In fact, one of the things that was part of the anti-corruption drive that Xi Jinping started was that Communist Party officials could no longer kind of waste money on these big expensive banquets. They couldn't like go out for these like big meetings and resorts and things like that. There was a big push to have the party be frugal so that they would not be seen as kind of being corrupt. They're probably still corrupt. They probably still steal a lot of money, but the Communist Party wanted them to appear to be frugal. And so there was a big push against profligate spending on the part of party officials on unnecessary items. And that in and of itself had a big impact on the producers of luxury goods, like foreign producers of luxury handbags, high-end drinks, all that kind of stuff. That market took a big hit in China after that particular aspect of the anti-corruption drive was implemented. So that really speaks to the power of the market there in terms of its effect on the global market.
Well, you talked before about in China, one of the big things that people negotiate when they're making deals and gaining power in politics is doing favors for people. So maybe that was more of the shift. They're still going to find a way to leverage their power in some capacity and just basically hurt the luxury goods industry, like you said, rather than made them less corrupt in general. Oh, I guess we can't buy expensive handbags. Time to be moral.
Yeah, there's always ways you can be corrupt. If you're really smart about it, you can always kind of find a way. So yeah, I mean, favors. Here in the United States, favors are a big thing. Like you can pay for a congressman's kid's tuition, and that's a gift, but it's not necessarily something you have to report like you would if they just gave you a shit ton of cash.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of that. There's the red envelope, the notorious red envelope, which was like in China, there's sort of this tradition when you give a gift to give the gift in the form of money that you put in a red envelope. And so in Chinese, and when their corruption happens, sometimes it involves like just a deliberate provision of a red envelope full of cash. I was told that doesn't happen as much, though. I have friends from China, and they say that that's kind of old-fashioned. That doesn't happen as much anymore. But yeah, there's always ways. Let's see. Oh wow. Okay. This is funny because we get one a week. We get at least one of these a week.
Cryptocurrency.
Yeah. How do I feel about the idea of switching to a more global economy, such as Bitcoin, and doing away with mass production and oversaturation of products, a la McDonald's, Kmart, etc., and returning to a bartering system enhanced with technology and the aforementioned global currency? Any immediate obvious flaws? I'd really have to think about it more, because like you say in the question here, it's a complex issue. I'd have to kind of think about it more to give a more thoroughgoing answer. I will say that if you're using a currency at all, then it's not a barter economy. So if you're using Bitcoin, that's not barter. And bartering is really hard. Like that's the whole advantage of money. If I have 10 bags of spicy Cheetos, which I actually do have here, I think. If I have 10 bags of spicy Cheetos, and you have several bushels of grain, you may not want to give that grain. But if you do, how many spicy Cheetos bags of spicy Cheetos do I give for one bushel of grain? That's kind of hard to negotiate. And it also gets exponentially more complex the larger the scale of the deals. So if you're kind of mass producing something, then it gets really hard to kind of negotiate with a broad swath of people for how much to get for that. And I think that's why you mentioned that. Why don't we move away from that? I mean, we're going to have mass production so long as it's more efficient. Mass production, for all of its ills, is a very cost-efficient way of producing large amounts of goods that people want and/or need. So I don't think it's likely we're going to abandon any kind of mass production anytime soon. Yeah, again, I'd kind of have to think more about it. You can always email me. The email is in there, and we can kind of talk about it. Kind of go back, have an exchange there. But off the top of my head, I'd kind of have to invest a little more thought. I do know that if you're interested in bartering, you can look at ALBA. ALBA is like a South American international organization that ties together these Chavista governments in South America. And I think the membership includes obviously Venezuela, Cuba, Ecuador, Bolivia, and I think Trinidad and Tobago. Probably a couple, I think Dominica, and maybe a couple other Caribbean nations. Oh, and Nicaragua too, I think. So those are all a part of an international organization called ALBA, and their big thing is they want to create kind of a single market, but instead of having it just be a single market, like you would construct a free market single market, like the European Union or what ECOWAS is trying to do, ALBA is more about managing international trade through bartering. So Cuba, for example, trades, I think doctors is their big thing, because they have a lot of doctors there. So they'll send doctors to countries, and then in exchange, those countries will send, whatever. Venezuela, of course, sends oil. So in Venezuela's case, they send a bunch of oil to Cuba, and then Cuba reciprocates with doctors. Obviously, that deal probably isn't doing so well now, because Venezuelan oil production is hitting. Venezuela's economy is doing so badly now that they can't produce oil as much as they could. It's falling significantly faster than it already was, just because I think the latest thing was that they couldn't afford to pay ships to transport the oil. Something like that. So they can't even get the oil out, what little they produce now. Well, they still produce quite a bit, but not as much as they were. Yeah, that's a mess over there in Venezuela. We could talk about that if somebody wants to. But ALBA is an interesting case study if you want to look at bartering. Let's see. So the next one was curious about continued Middle East Qatar squabble. The list of demands spoke about by the Saudis, AL, was seemingly never meant to be met. Is this to pressure Iran to distract from something Saudis are working at now to remove Al Jazeera? Yeah, it's meant to remove. Well, not just Al Jazeera. The principal thing that the Saudis want to do with this whole embargo, diplomatic embargo, is they want to remove support from the Muslim Brotherhood. That's their main thing. There's a lot of things on the list of shit they want the Qatari government to do, but the Muslim Brotherhood is by far the most important aspect, because the Qatari government definitely does support the Muslim Brotherhood, and that's seen as a big threat. Not only the Saudis not only see the Muslim Brotherhood as a big threat, the Egyptians also. So that's a kind of also the other members of the GCC in general. So that's kind of the main thing. And in so much as they want to remove Al Jazeera and they want to have all these other demands, a lot of it is meant. For example, they want Al Jazeera to be removed because Al Jazeera is a platform in which Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist figures communicate to the Middle East, because the Qatari government allows a wide spectrum of political actors to speak on Al Jazeera, Islamists among them, and Muslim Brotherhood figures notably. And that really rubs the Saudis and the Egyptians the wrong way. So it's much more that than just Al Jazeera or just one of the other items on the list. Almost every item on that list can be traced to the Muslim Brotherhood somehow. One of the things on the list is they want the Qatari government to refuse to allow the naturalization of citizens from other GCC countries. So if you're a political dissident in Saudi Arabia, you can move to Qatar and become naturalized and become a citizen there, and then hang out there, and then you could get on Al Jazeera and talk about how shitty the Saudi government is. So that aspect, that item on the list is meant to prevent dissidents, including Muslim Brotherhood members, from taking refuge in Qatar and using it as sort of a base to spread discontent and whatnot. So that's more the gist of it. It's not really meant to pressure Iran, because the Qataris are not that close to Iran. They're not blood enemies, but they're not allies either. They kind of keep their distance because they know that they can't get too close, because the Saudis would freak out and because the United States wouldn't like it. The United States has a huge naval base in Qatar. So there's a limit to the degree to which the Qataris will deviate from regional, what would be considered the norm for regional politics. And it's not as though they want to get closer with Iran anyway. The Qatari government's whole bag is kind of trying to be more neutral, relatively so. They certainly, for example, well, this isn't a good example of neutrality, but they were one of the first and most prominent supporters of rebel groups in Syria, and that was because they wanted to bring down the Syrian government. And I don't know in Qatar's case if that was kind of meant to reduce Iran's influence in the region, or if that was more meant just for kind of liberalize because they wanted to bring down an authoritarian government and give room to the people, probably more Islamists in their case, but kind of just creating a more pluralistic government there. You'd have to talk to somebody who knows more about the Qatari government and their foreign policy motivations for that. But yeah, that in general, that's my take on it. It's much more about the Muslim Brotherhood. Whether or not it was it seemingly never meant? No, I do think they meant it. I don't think the Saudis made that list thinking the Qataris would not cave in. But I do think that it was meant to be a long-term thing. This was meant to kind of mark a departure from previous status quo. Because before, the GCC was more or less all on the same page. And they could deviate a little bit. Qatar could kind of go and do its own thing. And, Kuwait and Oman, they're pretty much officially neutral as far as regional politics go, more or less. And so, countries could kind of deviate in terms of the GCC main line, but for the most part, they would coordinate. But this more marks like the end of that. It's more specifically defining the Qataris as something other, as specifically isolating and alienating them from the other GCC countries and marking them as a rival, like officially, rather than a partner who has different ideas about the direction the region should take. So I think over the long term, they do want the Qataris to meet those conditions, and they hope to bring enough pressure on them to do that. They're probably hoping the Trump government in particular does something to help them out, because the United States is pretty much the only power in the region that can force the Qataris' hand. The Qatari government has said they can hold out forever if they want. That's probably true. But if the United States really puts pressure on them, along with other allies, then they probably would have to cave at some point. Thus far, the U.S. government hasn't given any inclination, any hint that it wants to do that. And that kind of supports my notion. That kind of suggests that the Trump visit to the region last month and his whatever he said to the Saudis that made them think they could go do this, that kind of makes me think Trump just kind of said that off the cuff. I don't think there's really any game plan in the United States as far as this whole crisis goes. So the United States, I don't think, really wanted this to happen, and I don't think the government really knows what to do now that it has happened. And until there's kind of a change in direction there, until there's some explicit, instruction on what the position of the United States is, that's probably not going to change. And I don't think, even given what Trump's politics are, I don't think it's likely he'll really crack down on the Qataris, because there is a kind of that would be very politically costly. I think the government is going to want to focus much more on Syria and the Islamic State and Iran, rather than any kind of rivalry between the Saudis and the Qataris. So I suspect that'll be more the focus going forward. But I could be wrong. Trump has been nothing if not unpredictable thus far. So who's to say? I hope that kind of answers the question sufficiently. That was one of those meandering answers.
Well, there are some meandering issues, so.
So this question, can we talk about genocide in Yemen using weapons sold to Saudi Arabia by the United States? There's not any genocide in Yemen. There's no concerted effort to eliminate an ethnic group or anything like that. There is a lot of violence. And the conflict itself is pretty stupid, I think. I think political actors in Saudi Arabia kind of just want Yemen to be to use Yemen as proof that they're strong and that they're serious about imposing Saudi Arabia's will on the region, its vision on the region. And in particular, they want to use it as a kind of signal to Iran that the Saudis are very serious about countering Iranian influence, even if there's hardly any Iranian influence to be had in Yemen. The Yemen conflict is one of those really kind of tragic examples of what happens when leaders try to use conflicts as signals. The conflict itself is not going to accomplish much, really, and probably it could have ended, or at least not be nearly as violent as it is, if not for the fact that the Saudi government does want to kind of make an example of the Houthis and try to send a signal to its rivals in the region. As far as the Saudis using weapons sold by the United States, I mean, of course they are. They've bought quite a few and continue to do so.
We make some pretty nice weapons too.
Yeah, we're pretty. The United States is a pretty proficient producer of some pretty powerful weaponry. So, I don't. It's not shocking. I think what you're implying with the question is whether or not the United States should cut off sales to the Saudis in order to push them to stop the conflict or at least mitigate it. I don't find that likely, because one of the reasons that the Saudis are so active in the region and have been for the past 5 years is that the Obama administration really did not want to be proactive in the Middle East. They kind of wanted to depart from America's traditional role as sort of regional leader, and they wanted regional actors to take a larger role in solving the region's problems. And unfortunately, the downside of that is a lot of regional actors decided that war would be a really good solution to the region's problems. And so that was, I don't know if that was an unintended consequence or if the Obama administration just thought that was a necessary evil. If that's what they want to do, let them learn the hard way. I don't know what attitude they had exactly towards it, but I do know they wanted to kind of take a back seat and let the Saudis take a more prominent role. So in that sense, I don't think the Trump administration will put pressure on them, because it is an example of the Saudis kind of doing what the American government had wanted them to do, and probably kind of had wanted them to do for a while, which is to take more responsibility for the region so the United States wouldn't have to. Before, the impetus would have been on the United States to do something, quote unquote, about conflicts in the region like Syria and Yemen, and we would have probably done something that people here would not have liked, and probably what a lot of people in the region would not have liked. So now the Saudis kind of take more of a lead, and it's more clear to people in the region, if not the world, that these are more regional preferences and not just the United States imposing its will, so to speak. So I don't think the United States will cut off weapons supplies to Saudi Arabia. And I don't know that it would really matter if they did, because if the United States did cut off weapons sales, they would just go and buy them from Russia or some other, major arms dealer. They're not going to quit the war in Yemen because of the United States. Basically, that's what I'm saying. That's for different reasons that are probably not very good. The Saudi government considers the Yemeni conflict important to them, and the regime's security, and to regional affairs generally. So that conflict will probably continue unabated for the time being, at least until the Saudis can either come to their senses and see how kind of stupid the conflict is, or they could also just arbitrarily declare victory and leave and say, okay, we've done enough here.
We've done that.
We've said, our message has been conveyed. That's enough. We can go. Or if they can reach some kind of accord with the different actors in Yemen, that would be very difficult, because there's a lot of different actors in Yemen right now. The country basically has melted down. It had already been in meltdown before the conflict even started. It's only gotten worse since then. But if they could reach some kind of peace deal that it would either give the country peace or give the veneer of peace, that could act as a reason to de-escalate. But yeah, I wouldn't really consider it a genocide. Genocide gets thrown around a lot. A lot of people are getting killed. Oh, it's a genocide. Not really. Genocide is very purposeful. I think for an action or a conflict to encompass genocide, there has to be a real targeted effort to go after a given target ethnicity or community. Yeah, genocide is a very charged word in the modern era on account of the Holocaust, but its value, its shock value, has decreased over time, proportionate to the ease with which it's trotted out. I remember in the war in Georgia, between Russia and Georgia, which I've said it before, I'll say it again, it was a dumb war. I remember the Prime Minister of Georgia, I think he was Prime Minister, maybe he was President, I think his name was Mikhail Saakashvili. And during the war, when Georgia was getting invaded, he came on to CNN and American news networks, and he kept pleading genocide. He said, it's a genocide, you have to come and help us. The Russians are killing everybody. And obviously that was not the case, like very clearly, like just paying attention to the conflict. There's no genocide. Why but he just wanted to use it because he thought it would be a tool, an effective political tool, to get people on his side and to try to coerce international intervention in favor of Georgia against the Russian military. It was goofy, to put it mildly. So, yeah, just be careful with genocide. Not everything is genocide. There is definitely genocide in the world, but Yemen isn't one of them, in my opinion. That's my opinion. So this question here, can you talk a little bit about shadow banks in China? What exactly do they consist of, and how did the recent prosecutions against them affect global markets? So shadow banks are sort of these underground financial institutions. They're not even necessarily banks. They could just be like a guy. Yeah, basically. See, the problem in China is that it's really hard to find a good rate of return for your savings. So if you've got a lot of money that you want to save, you could just sit on it in cash and just have it be cash in a bank or under your mattress. But there's an opportunity cost there, because you could invest that money in something, and then the value of the project would grow, and then the amount of money would grow, right? Like if you invested in some company, and then the company grows and grows, then eventually you could sell your stock in the company, and you could get a lot more at the end of that than you had at the start. So you want to kind of grow your money. You want your money to quote unquote work for you, as they say in finance. But the trouble in China is that it's really hard to find a good investment like that, because the capital markets in China are sort of embryonic. They're still new, and they're also heavily regulated. So it's hard to find. I keep saying that it's hard to find a good investment. So one of the byproducts of that is that there's a black market in investments. Basically, you can go and find like dealers, you can find a guy on the street, or maybe you can find a company or a corrupt government official or somebody who can hook you up with a good investment. He can say, hey, you got a bunch of money to invest, I can get you an investment that'll give you like a 10% rate of return over however many years, or per year for however many years. And so then, like, if you're risk tolerant, or if you've got good guangxi, if you've got a good network and you've got people who can vouch for somebody or some company, then you might well take up that offer. You could well illegally or semi-legally invest in some project like that. And normally, legally, you're supposed to kind of do that through official channels. You should have like a bank, and then the bank invests it for you, or an investment bank, or something like that. But again, the rates of return there are limited. So shadow banks, as they're called, are kind of preferable if you're willing to take the risk. A lot of people have gotten burned doing that because it's an underground economy type thing. So, if you're dealing in the underground economy, there's no regulation. You can't go to the police and say, hey, I broke the law investing in this company. Can you please arrest this guy now that he's screwed me out of all the money I put into it? You can't do that. You'll get arrested first, principally. So it's a dangerous game, but a lot of people do it because there's a lot of money to be invested in China because of the economic growth there. What do they consist of? That's what they consist of. And how do recent prosecutions against them affect global markets? They don't affect global markets for the most part, because again, China's capital market is very regulated. And one of the ways it's regulated is that it's very hard for foreigners to invest in the Chinese market. And they're kind of trying slowly to link the Chinese market, capital market, to international markets, but they're taking their time. It's a very slow, incremental process. And so, whatever happens with shadow banks or the financial sector in China doesn't really have a global impact yet, at least not really. Maybe once things open up, that'll change, but for now, not so much. It could lead to more effort to get money out of China. That's been a big trend over the past few years, is a lot of people with money in China are trying to get the money out of China, out of the market, and into international markets. Part of that is just because there's a higher rate of return there, but also some of it is because of the anti-corruption drive. There's a lot of people who have, through various illegal means, accumulated large fortunes, and those people don't want that fortune to be in China where somebody could get it, like, say, the authorities or some other such group. And they also some people who may have gotten their fortune legitimately also want their money overseas, just in case they fall out of political favor, which is a thing that can happen in China. Like if you do something the government doesn't like or say something that the government doesn't like, they can come after you and they can totally just seize your assets if they want. And if that's the case, it really helps if your assets are not in China. You can push them overseas where they're harder to get. But with the capital controls in place, that can be hard to do. And so that's part of the reason people are trying to push money out of China. But again, like I said, part of the reason money is leaving China could also be because of the prosecutions of the shadow banks. That just eliminates an avenue of investment. And that because that money does want investment, that then leads them to try to go outside. So a big glut of Chinese investment overseas could be the effect on the global markets. I guess you could say that could be the result of prosecution of shadow banks. But I think the other factors I listed are more important to that. Let's see. New question. What makes a nation a nation? If a boat of 3 people wanted to be a nation, what is stopping them? So a nation, there's differences between a nation. A country is a different thing than a nation is a different thing than a state. Those are all kind of different ideas. So in order to be a nation, you need like a common identity. And generally that involves ethnicity. So like there is a nation of Croats, or a better example, Albanians. If you're Albanian, then you are part of the Albanian nation. But Albanians don't all live in Albania. They can live in different countries under the control of different states. But even if they live in a country outside Albania, because they're Albania, they're still part of that Albanian nation. So generally it's an ethnic identity thing, but it can also be more national identity. Like in France, French identity transcends ethnic identity. So you can say you're part of the French nation, even if you're not ethnically French per se. But you could be like ethnically Arab, but grew up in France and maybe adapted the culture, or maybe you migrated to France and adapted the culture, or assimilated into the culture. In that case, you would then be French. And if you're French and then adhere to some amount of the French culture and you don't live in France, you could then say that you too are part of the French nation. I'm sure people in Quebec would say they're part of the French nation, maybe to a lesser degree Cajuns in Louisiana do. It's kind of an ambiguous concept, and it's not like clearly demarcated how, say, French you would have to be part of the French nation. It's not that exact type of thing. There's no exact measurement you could use to demarcate that.
You must be this French to ride this ride.
Yeah. So I don't think you could be like 3 people in a boat and say, all right, we're a nation. Unless you're like the last survivors of, if you're the last 3 cities in the world and you're on a boat, then maybe then you could say you're in a nation. But, beyond that, probably not so much. Maybe you could arbitrarily declare a country, a state, but if nobody recognizes you, that has no validity, really. International recognition plays a big role in terms of defining what's a country and what's not. Like North Ossetia is recognized only by Russia and maybe a few other countries, but most countries in the international community do not recognize North Ossetia as an independent country. So whether or not you think North Ossetia is a country it doesn't depend on like any official definition of what a country is. It more depends on what country you live in and what the diplomatic stance is regarding North Ossetia. What determines the value of a currency, and how would a country create a new one? What determines the value of a currency? So currencies are traded right now in the current international regime. Currency is float, which means the value of a currency is determined by the market. And so by extension, you could say that the value of a currency is determined by the value of the goods that a country exports. So if you have something that a lot of other countries want, then your exports would be sufficiently high that the value of your currency would go up. So in that case, your value of your currency would appreciate. In turn, if you started importing more than you were exporting, or if you just went out and printed a bunch of money and tried to buy stuff overseas, that would devalue your currency. So really it kind of comes down to the economy, or economies as the case may be, in which the currency is used. the U.S. dollar is used. Well, the United States economy uses the U.S. dollar, and so that gives the U.S. dollar a lot of value because there's just a lot of stuff made in the U.S. that people want outside of the U.S. In the European Union, you have a lot of different countries, but they all use the euro for the most part. Most of them use the euro. And because Europe produces a whole lot of shit, that makes the euro valuable. Because if you want to buy any of that stuff, that desirable European stuff that they make over there, then you need to get euros. So then euros become valuable. In contrast, the whatever currency it was they were using in Zimbabwe before hyperinflation destroyed it, not so much making stuff. In fact, Zimbabwe used to export a lot of food. It used to be like a major agricultural producer, but then a lot of the reforms that the Mugabe government implemented kind of destroyed Zimbabwe's agricultural sector. And so because they stopped exporting food because they weren't producing as much food, and people didn't have as much reason to go to Zimbabwe and buy anything, because the food was the principal reason that people would import stuff from Zimbabwe. So the Zimbabwe currency devalued. And that, along with other practices by the Zimbabwe government, just destroyed the value of the currency over time. So that's kind of a quick and dirty explanation of the value of currencies in the present regime. There's like a whole history to currencies you would get into. How would a country create a new one? You would just issue it. It's not hard. You just print it out. Generally, you would need like one thing you could do is you could say, have the government of your country say that taxes have to be paid in this new currency. That could give the currency's validity. If you have a central bank, well, you could just create a central bank, and then the central bank could say, all right, or the government could pass a law saying that if you're a bank in this country, then you have to exchange all of your currency, whatever you have, to the central bank in exchange for the new currency. So then everybody has the new currency. Those are a couple new ways. The question isn't, the real difficulty is not making a new currency. Anybody could do that. I mean, we could do that. We could get a printing press. In fact, there are actually some localities that make their own currency, which is technically legal because they peg it to the dollar or the euro or wherever they are. But yeah, it's not hard to make a new currency. The really difficult thing is making it legitimate, to legitimize it, to make sure the market recognizes it, uses it, and gives it value. So the challenge is giving new currency market value. And you would do one of the things I just said, having the central bank switch out currencies or having taxes be paid in that currency. There's probably a couple other tricks that I can't remember off the top of my head. Actually, here's an interesting currency story. Brazil traditionally has suffered from a lot of inflation. It's like generally relatively high. And high inflation, you can actually run an economy pretty fine with high inflation. It can be done. Like Russia, Brazil, a lot of other countries traditionally have kind of lived with relatively high inflation. But it kind of got a little bit out of control in the, late 80s, early 90s, something around there. And so some Brazilian central bank officials and the Brazilian government, they all kind of had a big meet. And they said, all right, how can we deal with this? Because the Brazilian government had tried at various points in its history to reduce inflation, and it never worked because, political considerations limited the ability of the government to reduce spending, economic downturns, the need to expand the money supply during economic downturn, just different reasons. And so they got together and said, all right, how the hell do we deal with this? And so they actually implemented a really clever solution. It's pretty impressive how they did it. They actually just introduced a new currency. And the new currency didn't have inflation, because a lot of the inflation in Brazil was not being driven by the economy, it was being driven by expectations. People expected the currency to inflate, to lose value, and so people kept increasing prices to match the devaluation. But because people just did that sort of robotically, they just did it in expectation, after a while, it kind of was detached from economic forces. So the currency, I think it was the real or something, just kept devaluing because people kept increasing prices and wages had to keep increasing to match the increase in prices. And so then it was sort of a cycle. So the Brazilian government introduced a new currency, and for a while it was not really in the markets. They just pegged it to like a basket of foreign currencies, I think. And so they introduced, basically by doing that, what they were doing was introducing confidence in the market. They were showing that this new currency will not devalue like this other, like the currency we have now. And so they traded it with a few banks, like high-level banks. Those were the first institutions they introduced it to. And those banks traded in it, and it was used for some international deals. So it was kind of traded in the international market, but it wasn't really like the official currency of Brazil in the initial stage. And they did that for like I think like 6 months to a year or something. And so what that served to do was to establish the new currency's value in the market. And so once the currency's value was established, it was only then that they started having banks in the country start switching out the previous currency for the new one. And as they did that, they found that people stopped increasing their prices because they realized that, okay, this new currency isn't devaluing. I don't expect inflation. Therefore, I will not increase my prices. And so that stopped the cycle and introduced price stability for the first time in several decades in Brazil. It worked pretty well, and it was actually a sort of a policy triumph. It's a very interesting case study. Of course, subsequent events kind of mitigated it. They increased government spending sufficient to reintroduce inflation, and that inflation has been persistent enough to kind of reintroduce a little bit of those expectations. It's not as bad as it was before, but they're kind of getting back to that point. But case study is still legit, pretty interesting. What are your thoughts on the proposed healthcare repeal, Obamacare repeal, Medicaid rollback, and do you think it'll go through because of the Republican majority? Not really. I don't think it'll pass, honestly. From what I mean, I'm not like a big political guy, so I don't know like all of the machinations up in Washington and how they're dealing with that. But yeah, from what I've read, it doesn't seem likely. You know, it's kind of you know, if they change the bill, if they change the bill, if they change the law that they've drawn up in a way that appeals to the right wing of the Republican Party, well, then they lose the left wing of the Republican Party. They won't vote for it. But then if they change it to appeal to the left wing of the Republican Party, then the right wing won't vote for it. So there's this big competition within the Republican Party right now, and it's actually kind of a pre-existing thing. There's been a schism within the Republican Party for probably like 10 years now, probably going back even further than that, between like these sort of moderates, I guess, if you want to call them that, and then sort of the Tea Party. And then, of course, Trump has thrown in like a third faction, like that's like a whole nother dimension to it that complicates it even further. So right now there's so much dysfunction and disagreement within the Republican Party. It doesn't seem likely that they'll be able to get something done. So I wouldn't invest too much in, I wouldn't worry too much about it at this point. It doesn't seem like anything. The Senate certainly is of that mind. A number of Senate Republicans and other senators have come out and said this is dead, this isn't going to happen, at least in its present form. They're probably going to end up changing it a lot before they reach any kind of deal, and it probably will be watered down so much it won't matter. You know, I won't, unless somebody wants to, I won't like get into the whole healthcare thing and, you know, the healthcare debate, but I will say pretty much what I said the last time we talked about it, which is that the final outcome probably will be that the federal government just pushes it back to the states and lets states kind of decide for themselves what kind of system they want. And that'll probably involve a lot of negotiation and a lot of fighting. I'm not saying it's going to happen in the medium to short term. It's probably something an equilibrium that will be reached in the long term. But I don't know that there's any other kind of way or deal can be reached that substantially solves the problem of modern American healthcare. At least not with the people in Washington right now, anyway. They're just too far apart in terms of the type of healthcare system they want. So I thought this was pretty interesting. There's a border standoff over in, it's actually in Bhutan technically, but it involves India and China. Have you ever heard of Bhutan, Neuro?
Sounds kind of familiar, but I know shit about it.
Yeah. Well, you know the Himalayan mountains, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Bhutan is like this little Buddhist kingdom that's in the Himalayan mountains, and it's one of two Himalayan countries. I hope I'm pronouncing Himalayan right. It's one of two Himalayan countries that separates India and China. And Bhutan, which is a constitutional monarchy, I think they just became one like 10 years ago. It's a relatively recent development. But anyway, Bhutanese politics aside, Bhutan has a long-running sort of border dispute with China. And there's sort of this little kind of triangle, right? There's Bhutan, and then there's this little triangle of Chinese territory that juts in to the west of Bhutan and separates it from Indian territory to the west. And what the Chinese did is they started building a road into that triangle along the border with Bhutan in the disputed area. And so the Bhutanese said, well, of course, they didn't like it, so they complained about it. And then the Indian government came in to back them up. Because the Indian government, one of the central planks of Indian national security over the past half century has been keeping the Chinese on the other side of the Himalayas. They don't want them to get a kind of a foothold in the Himalayan mountains because they don't want them to be able to just kind of flood in to the Gangetic Plain, sort of the North Indian Plain there where it's nice and flat. So the mountains are like a natural defensive chain for them. And they don't want the Chinese butting in and using their superior power to kind of lay claim to this disputed area because they see it as kind of, well, so to speak, the thin end of the wedge. If we let them take this, what else are they going to take? Because China and India have a number of disputes as well between them. They actually fought a border war in the, late 60s, I think, that the Chinese got the better of. I think they ended up taking a bunch of territory in northeastern Kashmir that the Chinese claimed, but they didn't do as well in Arunachal Pradesh. The Chinese basically claimed this entire province of India in the northeastern part of India. But the Chinese fought them there, and they didn't make really any headway during that border conflict. But in Bhutan, they're kind of leaning on them, and the Indians have come in on the Bhutanese side, and there was a kind of a standoff where some Indian troops came in and kind of tried to block the Chinese from doing their work, and the Chinese rushed them basically and destroyed, I think, how would you say it? They deconstructed, shall I say, 2 bunkers. Well, I don't think they fought them. It wasn't like a battle. They didn't blow them up, but they did take them apart. They did kind of rush the position, push past the Indians. But then the Indians formed like a human wall, and they just kind of held their ground. And at that point, the Chinese backed off. And that's kind of an ongoing standoff right now. They'll probably have a negotiated settlement ended, but for now, it's still kind of ongoing. We'll see what happens with it.
Pull up a map. Bhutan.
Special thanks go to PactFact over there, for handling all the questions. It's much appreciated. I'm sorry to interrupt the pool thing. I hope it wasn't. I hope we didn't make her leave too soon or anything like that.
I think it was pretty much good. She got a little bit of the roasty toasty from the sun. Thanks, sun, for being so bright. Alright, so yeah, I see Tibet to the north. You've got Bengalia to the south? What is that?
What are we looking at?
Bhutan, just the location of the country. Yeah, you've got India. It's funny, India has that little arm that reaches over to the east and hugs Bangladesh all the way around.
Yeah. There's like a little narrow stretch of territory that connects it with that region. It's called the Chicken Neck, India's Chicken Neck. And it's a very strategically sensitive area for the Indians. And that disputed territory that Bhutan has with China, that's pretty close to the Chicken Neck. So the Indian government is very, whenever anything happens there, they're very much on it. In fact, let me think. There's a narrow stretch of territory. You might be able to see it there, between Bhutan and Nepal. I think that's what it is, if I'm remembering this correctly. And it's a little stretch of Indian territory that connects with China. And that little, is it there?
Yeah, there is. It's between Bhutan and Nepal.
Okay.
It's called
Yeah.
Sikkim
Yeah, Sikkim, that's it.
by
That
Darjeeling.
actually that actually used to be an independent kingdom like Nepal and Bhutan. It was an independent Buddhist kingdom. And what happened was in the 60s, and I think this was after the border war, I want to say, maybe before. I'm flaking, I can't quite remember. But at some point after Indian independence, the Indian government actually invaded Sikkim. It had been independent, but they wanted it. And for one specific reason, there's actually a pass through the Himalayan mountains there. And they were afraid that if the Chinese government either conquered it or subverted the government and made Sikkim into an ally, that the Chinese military would then be able to use that pass to attack India and perhaps cut it off from that eastern region there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that big eastern region there called Assam. That and I think 8 other little provinces are over there. Very kind of ethnically distinct from the rest of India. It's kind of an interesting region in its own right. But because it's kind of far away from the rest of India, it's strategically vulnerable, especially because of that chicken neck. And there's a lack of infrastructure as well that makes it difficult to get there, to move troops and things there.
Yeah.
So India is very kind of concerned in terms of national security about Chinese pressure there. Do you see that north there where it says Arunachal Pradesh, just north of Assam? That's the disputed territory with China. China claims that entire thing.
China's really good at claiming territory. Yeah, that's ours.
Yeah. Yeah, and the thing is that basically that whole province is Himalayan mountains. That's like the entire chunk of the mountain range there. That whole province is just Himalayan mountains. So if the Chinese could get control of it, that would put their military on the other side of the mountains in a position where they could pressure Assam. Now, another reason that the Indians are so sensitive about that, besides the obvious, is that China is a big ally of Pakistan. And of course, Pakistan is India's like big rival, or at least the Pakistanis certainly think so. So there's a fear that if there were a conflict between India and Pakistan, that the Chinese might jump in on the Pakistani side and would attack in that area. So the Indians want to make sure that in the event that happens, that the Chinese are on the other side of the Himalayan mountains and not in a position where they can come in and cut off Assam from the rest of India or invade Assam itself. So that's kind of a quick rundown of that region's strategic importance in history.
Yeah, it's cool. It's one that's very easy to forget about because you don't usually think of countries having pieces of territory that stretch through, like you said, the chicken neck, a very narrow segment. And then it's actually a pretty large area over there. You've got Assam, Meghalaya, Manipur, Mizoram, Tripura, Nagaland. And they're all, pretty sizable.
Yeah, Assam is the main one, but all of the others kind of have their own. Basically, every ethnicity has their own province over there, more or less. And it's a distinctive. The Indians call those provinces the Seven Sisters, because I think there's about 7 of them, at least the smaller ones anyway. And they're all very Asian. Like the people there look more Asian. Like Indians have a distinctive, almost European look to them, only with darker skin.
Yeah.
But the people who live in Assam and the Seven Sisters, much more Asiatic, and a little bit culturally distinctive. Everybody in Southeast Asia is influenced by Indian culture, language and religion and cultural, influence, that kind of thing. But racially speaking, much more Asiatic, much closer to China or the Thai people.
Yeah, and one of the cool aspects is kind of going from westerly to easterly. You see that gradual transition where it's not strictly distinct from looking Asian or Indian. It's the progression across different ways that humans look based on how they intermingle in the geography of the area. So I'm guessing the Arunachal Pradesh has very few people there. That's one of the reasons why it's disputed. It seems like the fewer the people who are in an area, the easier it is for it to remain disputed, because there's not a whole lot of population at stake.
Yeah, that's pretty accurate. Yeah, Tibet for a long time was quasi-independent, and hardly anybody has ever lived there, so the Chinese found it pretty easy to maintain that claim, and then eventually invade in the 1950s. Yeah, it's fun talking to Chinese people about Tibet because it's very awkward for them. There's like for example, in China, the Dalai Lama is a terrorist, like flat out.
Yeah.
He's like this really evil, malign figure who wants to, rip apart China and separate it. And so if you talk to them about the Dalai Lama, it's like, how can you guys? Why does your leaders meet with them? And it's everybody here is like, why wouldn't you? It's the Dalai Lama. It's a very surreal. It's a very different perspective they have over there.
Well, I have some fun personal experience with accusations of terrorism because I have that Black Lives Matter t-shirt, which is more a response to the systemic oppression of blacks in America, and people will ask me why I support a terrorist organization. So, kind of like you were saying with the genocide, it's one of those blanket accusations that people use very loosely in terms of I don't like this, or for genocide it's this is very violent, it's genocide, rather than like you were saying it's targeting a specific ethnic group in a systematic way.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it's not really. I mean, that's a whole nother discussion you could have. What is terrorism? How do you define terrorism?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what is that? And basically, the way it's used in effect is anything you don't like is a terrorist.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I'm old enough, and maybe you are too, Neuro, to remember, 9/11. Before 9/11, there were a number of conflicts in the world. Actually, there were probably more conflicts before 9/11 than after, even. That's something to check. But there were a number of conflicts before 9/11, and almost all of them had involved governments fighting against quote-unquote rebels or insurgents or separatists or what have you. And then 9/11 happened. And then the next week, all of those same conflicts involved governments versus terrorists. They'd all become terrorists overnight.
Well, I think that really speaks to the asymmetry of that type of conflict, where it's not two comparable militaries that are fighting a full-scale war. It's people with a vast military advantage technologically, air superiority, the logistics, all that, versus people who are present and have much weaker technology, but they're present in the native area. So they have a lot of those defender's advantage elements, and they can intermingle with the civilian population really well, so it's hard to identify them.
Yeah, that's a big part of it. But in Sri Lanka, for example, the disparity in power and technology was not so great.
Mm-hmm.
In the Sri Lankan Civil War, the government and the Tamil Tigers, for most of the conflict, were on relatively even terms. The government was always more powerful, but the Tamil Tigers were close enough that they were actually able to fight them as conventionally. They didn't fight them as a rebel group. They actually went toe-to-toe with the Sri Lankan military, and in a lot of cases they won and actually carved out their own state in northern and eastern Sri Lanka. So in that case, the Sri Lankan government had referred to them as rebels and separatists, and occasionally terrorists, but after 9/11, it was always terror. These are terrorists. And the Tamil Tigers definitely did use terrorist methods. They had used suicide bombers. In fact, they were probably the first major group to systematically take advantage of suicide bombers as a tactic. And not just in combat, but like as a strategic thing where you blow up civilians and blow up government officials, and sort of symbolic attacks, political violence in that sense. They did that earlier than a lot of Islamist groups did. They actually did it before the Palestinians did it, and the Palestinians, of course, are probably most famous for it now. So terrorism does that make the Tamil Tigers terrorists? I mean, kind of. I mean, it's an ethnic conflict. They're separatists. They basically had their own country, and they were using violence. They were using political violence to try to pressure their opponents, and part of that involved using violence against civilians. But on the other hand, they also had an army, and they also fought in a number of other ways. So, how important do terrorist methods have to be to an organization to make them a quote-unquote terrorist organization, as opposed to just an organization that uses terrorism? And that's kind of an open question. And, also, what attacks qualify as terrorism? There's a lot of people who, well, I mean, in public, like in the media and in, layman conversation, there are people who considered the Beirut barracks bombing in Lebanon to be a terrorist attack. Are you familiar with that at all?
I don't think so.
It was like 1982. It was during the Lebanese Civil War, which is an interesting topic in its own right. But during the Lebanese Civil War, at one point, Ronald Reagan sent in American troops to try to help, I think, provide stability. I don't remember quite exactly what the logic was. But the Marines were sent in, and their barracks was attacked. It was blown up by a suicide bomber in a truck. Yet it was a suicide, what would you call it? Like a car bombing, basically. And that killed something like over 100, 200 Marines. And that was called a terrorist attack, but it was against a military target. And I think it was Hezbollah that did it. And Hezbollah had pretty good reason to assume the United States was not going to enter Lebanon and fight on their side, because Hezbollah was an explicitly anti-Israeli organization then as it is now. And so for them, they were attacking an enemy. That was an opponent. So they had an opponent that they basically thought of as an enemy, and they attacked that opponent's military. They blew up 200 Marines. And they used a suicide bombing to do that, but does that count as terrorism then?
Well,
kind of.
So the evaluation, rather than are they terrorists or not, is this organization terrorist or not? How terrorist is this organization?
Yeah, that's a lot of it. Kind of comes down to that. A lot of it is kind of relative, and it's also, using suicide bombers does not in and of itself make an organization terrorist. Nor is the tactic itself of using suicide bombers a terrorist tactic. In that sense, you could say that kamikazes in World War II were terrorists, because those were pretty explicitly suicide bombers. But that's not counted as terrorism because they were attacking military targets, as part of a conflict. I mean, in general, in the literature on terrorism, if you're attacking a military target, it's generally not considered terrorism. That's considered maybe guerrilla warfare or insurgent or something else, something of that vein, but not terrorism. So in that sense, the Beirut bombing was not terrorism, but an attack on the United States and the United States military. So then there's a question here. North Korea's successful ICBM launch seems to be provoking a lot of direct action from the UN. I'm curious what I think about what the world's response will be, as well as specific nations like South Korea and the US. There's not a lot that the South Koreans and the United States can do about it, really. I mean, there's an old saying here in the United States, don't gamble anything you're not willing to lose. And I don't think the United States is willing to incur the losses of a war in order to kind of shut down the North Korean nuclear program and missile program. So I don't think the United States wants a war, which is why the Trump administration is really pushing the diplomatic angle. They're especially pressuring China. Actually, I can kind of get into that a little bit. But the South Korean government, they just elected in South Korea kind of a center-left government. And the center-left in South Korea has a more accommodative approach to North Korea and the problems with North Korea. So they're not likely to want a war either. They also probably want a diplomatic solution. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if the South Korean government kind of pushed the United States to tone it down a little bit and take a more relaxed, well, not necessarily relaxed approach, but a less militaristic approach, because they don't want to escalate into a conflict, especially because, that's a problem for Seoul. For anybody who does not know, in South Korea, the largest city and capital is Seoul, and that city is all of like 20-some miles from the demilitarized zone, basically from the North Korean border. It's very close. And if a war broke out, the threat generally made by the North Koreans is that they would turn it into a quote-unquote sea of fire. They have a number of missile systems and long-range indirect fire weaponry that they could use against Seoul. And the expectation is that in the event of a conflict, that the North Koreans would just unload any number of missiles and artillery shells into Seoul and just kill, tens of thousands of people probably. So the South Koreans really don't want a conflict. That's the long and short of it. So really, the emphasis is on the Chinese, because the Chinese are sort of North Korea's de facto allies. They're not very good allies. The North Koreans are not very good allies of China. they're kind of allies with China in the same way that Pakistan is an ally of the United States. It's a very contentious sort of frenemy type relationship. But China does have strong economic ties with North Korea, which is why everybody who has an interest in mitigating North Korea's missile program are turning to the Chinese and saying, look, only you can do something about this. You need to cut your trade with North Korea and use the threat of further trade curtailing as a sort of carrot, or rather stick, as a stick to deter the North Koreans. So the Trump administration has come out very hard on China on that count. And let me see, there's a big kind of diplomatic blitz against China as far as North Korea goes, and part of it includes I suspect that there's this human trafficking watch list in the United States that I don't know which department controls it, but it basically ranks countries based on how their laws and police handle human trafficking. And China has kind of been on the bubble a little bit. They don't have the lowest ranking, but the United States has been threatening over the past few years to degrade their ranking, because they haven't been doing as much as they could be doing on that count. And so finally, they were degraded, I think a month or two ago. And maybe that has to do with human trafficking, but that could also be part of diplomatic pressure brought against China. The United States also signed off on a big deal, an arms deal rather, with Taiwan, which is always very contentious. And you don't really sign off on an arms deal with Taiwan if you're the United States unless you want to send a message. Generally, that's when it happens. If there's kind of a downturn in relations with China or something like that, then the deal is cleared. Mind you, there are generally deals in the pipeline with Taiwan, and the United States will generally kind of not accept or reject them. They'll just kind of let them sit. And they'll tell the Taiwanese, look, we can't really do this right now. Relations with China are going pretty good. We don't want to fuck it up. But then if things kind of get a little iffy with China, then whatever deal has been on hold, that'll get the okay. So an arms deal with Taiwan went through. That's probably a signal to China to kind of do something about North Korea also. Excuse me. Sanctions were brought. This is specifically related with North Korea. There's a bank in China that was found supposedly to have been involved in trade with North Korea. It's a Chinese bank. And so sanctions on North Korea were extended to that bank. You can actually extend sanctions on a country beyond just that country to institutions like businesses and whatnot that do trade with that country somehow. So that bank was targeted by those sanctions in a new sort of rule that the Trump administration wrote up. And a couple of individuals involved as well. So these are all Chinese people and Chinese institutions, and the United States did not consult the Chinese government. They did not go to the Chinese government and say, hey, we found these guys, this bank, can you do something about it? If you don't, we're going to drop the hammer on them. Instead of going through that consultative process, the United States just went right for the jugular and slapped sanctions on them. And that's also a strong signal sent to China to do something about North Korea. The steel dumping thing, you could argue, is partly about North Korea. It might be that the Trump administration is threatening China with steel tariffs in order to coerce them to do more in North Korea. And then the South China Sea thing, the U.S. naval vessel, I think a destroyer, sailed very close to a disputed island in the South China Sea. That's what they call a freedom of navigation operation, because the United States does not recognize these operations, does not recognize China's claim to the region. It recognizes the area as in dispute, but the idea that these islands are officially a part of China, that's not recognized at all. So periodically, the U.S. Navy will sail ships into the disputed region just to show we don't recognize this claim, and we're going to keep doing this until it's officially settled through normal channels. That might just be part of the South China Sea's dispute, so it might be separate than the North Korean thing. But you could also argue that the United States wants to take advantage of the South China Sea dispute and freedom of navigation operations to kind of tweak the nose of the Chinese government. They also sent in some B-1 bombers into the South China Sea, into that airspace down there, just to buzz the airspace and say, we can fly through this area too if we want, and there's nothing you can do about it. So all of those things I just listed are all different ways that the United States government can kind of pressure China on North Korea. And I think, to different degrees, the United States government ties the abatement of certain of these forms of pressure to movement on the North Korean issue. So there's been a lot of diplomatic dancing as far as pressuring China, and those are all different ways it's being done. What would it take to make a single government for all humanity? And do you think that unifying humanity would be a good thing for scientific advancements? A one world government. I mean, it depends on what your time frame is. Like over the very long term, you could kind of slowly build it up incrementally with something like the UN or some other international institution. And then kind of build that up into some kind of de facto unified world government. I mean, the trouble is that a lot of countries will not want to give up sovereignty. So whatever world government you end up with, assuming you get to it at all, is probably going to be very, very weak and very decentralized. So it's the most likely outcome as far as world government in the short to medium term, probably just something very decentralized and very ineffectual. That's probably the best you could do. Maybe in the long term, you could build something up over time as international trade and economies across the world become more intertwined. A global government makes more sense as that happens. Because as economies become more intertwined, there's more of a need for a sort of universal regulation, a kind of world regulatory regime that can handle disputes between areas. You know, if economies are isolated economic entities, then trade and trade disputes within them can all be handled by governments in those areas. But once you get to something like world economic trade, integrated world supply chains and that kind of thing, it helps a lot to have international, some kind of dispute resolution mechanism. To a degree, we already have that. In fact, you could argue that we already have a kind of world government in the form of different, sort of cumulatively, if you add together all of the different global institutions, they kind of all together form a kind of world government, like the World Trade Organization. That has.
We were just talking about G20 earlier, which is basically leaders coming together to discuss stuff that is in the benefits of people in general. So it's not one nation that's been codified as a single thing or one country, but it is a bunch of countries together that are representing the whole world and deciding what's best.
Yeah. Well, the thing about G20, though, is that it doesn't have any institutions. That's more of an informal meetup. Mm-hmm. It's important to the management of international affairs, like you say, but it lacks institutional presence, so to speak. So like the World Trade Organization has an agreed upon dispute resolution mechanism. It has a court system that you can go to if there's a dispute between countries about trade. So that's an example of the type of regulatory regime you would need for a world government, and that a world government would be responsible for. The UN is kind of the legislature, a world legislature of a sort. It has virtually no legislative power, so if you wanted to kind of upscale that a bit, maybe then you could turn that into a component of a prospective world government. But it does have the sort of the trappings of a global legislature. And then, of course, the United States government is basically the global administrative branch of the global government, and it effectively already has that role in terms of things like drugs, testing drugs, for pharmaceutical use. What is it called? The Food and Drugs Administration of the United States government is sort of the world's leading drug testing institution. The Europeans also have one over in the European Union, and they do a lot of drug testing on their own, but the FDA is kind of considered top dog, and a lot of countries just kind of go by its rulings in order to decide what drugs are sort of acceptable, ready for market, so to speak. So that's a kind of global. The FDA isn't just an American institution in that sense, it's kind of a global institution. Obviously, the United States military is kind of like the global police force. Obviously, a lot of people don't like how it's used, but it does kind of serve that role. It does sort of police the global commons and ensure sort of open sea lanes and open trade, and ensures conflicts do not sort of proliferate. That sort of thing that a global government would do in a policing capacity, the United States military kind of already does, and the British military did before it. So in that sense, you already kind of have a global police force. So global police force, global regulatory regime, global legislature, you already kind of have the pieces in place for a global government. But right now, they're all controlled by different actors and they have different levels of power. Like right now, the executive branch of the United States government is effectively like an authoritarian state globally. Like the United States government within the United States is restricted by the Constitution, but it's not nearly so restricted in the international sphere. And so in that sense, it's kind of like a sort of taxation without representation. It's like an authoritarian regime that just controls or heavily influences a lot of parts of the world. I don't think that the United States is an empire, and we can kind of have a discussion about that and the role of the United States government and the role it plays in international affairs and policing the global commons. But as far as global government, it kind of is a corollary in that sense. And what effect would it have on scientific advancements? That just depends on how you set it up. Like in StarCraft, for example, in StarCraft, Earth actually has in the future anyway, will have an authoritarian single one world government. And it's very heavily centralized, it's very authoritarian. Something like that, that could obviously generate a lot of tax revenue, would have a lot of revenue to work with, so they could heavily invest in science research and that kind of thing. So in that sense, potentially good. Probably though, if it is, again, the most likely case is a very decentralized government, world government. In that case, probably not much. Most of the research would probably be done where it's always been done, which is mostly in developed countries. I think I've talked with you, Neuro, before. If the world were one country, it would be a developing country. That's the type of country it would be.
Yep.
And like any developing country, there would be really poor parts, there would be really wealthy parts, and there would be parts kind of in the middle that are sort of, growing and evolving. And, if you live in a developed country, you would live in the wealthy, well-off part of that one world country. If you were living in a town, we here in the United States would be living in like the really good part of town where everybody lives in like a big mansion. This is the really good, developed, advanced part of the world.
The nice gated community.
Yeah, exactly. So in the event of if the world were one country, most of the economic activity, research and development, and that kind of thing would probably still happen here in the developed world. Having one government probably wouldn't change that much. This is kind of an aside, but the European Union and Japan did agree to a free trade deal.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of been in negotiations for a while. And they agreed to it just before the G20, and they made a big deal about it. They had all these sort of press releases about how, it was the triumph of liberalism, and how, even if certain other countries don't want to expand the global liberal trade regime, we're still going to push. This isn't over yet. We're going to kind of keep developing trade links. And then it kind of came out later that actually it wasn't like a free trade deal. It was just an agreement to later on agree to a free trade deal. That it was basically like a preliminary agreement to kind of continue talks and kind of continue negotiating it. So that kind of revealed it as a political maneuver. It was basically just something they wanted to use against Trump. They wanted to kind of use that to set the tone for the G20 meeting, to say, kind of signal to the United States and Trump that even if the United States isn't pushing for free trade and a liberal sort of international order, Europe and Japan still are, and they're going to do that. And they wanted to make that clear to the United States right from the start with a really strong signal. Would have been stronger if it had been an actual trade deal, but trade deals are very hard to negotiate, so the preliminary agreement was the best they could do.
We can relate to that in Blizzard. They tend to make announcements that they're going to make an announcement, which isn't actually progress toward anything, but it does kind of set the tone for what people are thinking about. Conversational strategy.
Yeah, a little bit of political theater there. Yeah, theater is a big part of, business and politics. It's all sort of part of the same game. It's all about manipulating expectations in your target audience. Let's see. So somebody's asking, what would the ability to colonize space do to our economy? Hypothetically, and this is it's a hypothetical question basically, because it's hard to tell. It would depend a lot on the technology available. It would depend a lot on economic opportunities that were found in space. And in turn, it would depend on the state of the economy in the world. You know, if there were some resource that could only be found in space or some other such thing. In that case, it would be economically viable. So I think in that sense, the ability to colonize space, in the event that there was some need for resources that could be only found there, I mean, it could stand to improve in technology, technological development, research. It could make, obviously it would make certain things cheaper, or maybe some things possible at all if you couldn't find any of those resources on Earth. So in that sense, it has the potential to significantly influence the economy. But beyond that, I mean, there's just a lot of different factors, a lot of unknowns there that would have to be kind of clarified. There's a lot of what ifs and whatnot. So basically, the real answer to that question is it depends. It's too early now to kind of really make a good prediction. That's kind of more the realm of science fiction. And, unfortunately, I don't read enough science fiction, so I can't really give you a better answer than that. I'm sure somebody who is more well-read could probably flesh that out a little better.
There was a recent bit in the news about the composition of the Martian environment and how it's very, very heavy on salt, which makes it unlikely that we're going to discover some type of Martian life, probably bacterial there, just because it's so uncomfortable for bacteria to survive in that type of environment. If you think slugs being very weak, slugs and snails to salt. Smaller organisms don't really like high levels of salt either.
Yeah. That's pretty interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah. It's, in the space ethics type of thing, it makes us potentially have less of an ethical quandary. If we were to find Martian life and we move there, it's very likely that we'll just either kill it or wipe it out, rather than it killing us or something like that.
Oh. Well, that's comforting.
Yeah, so we have a bit of a green light, I guess.
Yeah, gotta get that Lebensraum. Martian Lebensraum.
Manifest destiny.
In space.
In space.
Okay, Trump. Somebody asked, Trump-Putin meeting was supposed to be 30 minutes, yet it was purported to run in excess of 2 hours, 15 minutes. What do you make of this? I don't know. I couldn't tell you. I have no idea. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot to discuss. I mean, Syria, Ukraine, international trade, coordination with terrorism. Supposedly, they also talked a lot about cybersecurity, which I love, because cybersecurity just as a name is weird to me, because that's such an example of like institutions just going off on their own. Like, here in the real world, we just call that hacking. It's just, yeah, sometimes there's hacking, sometimes there's security problems with networks. I mean, but then what happened was, in the national security apparatus here in the United States, in conjunction with allied such national security institutions in other countries, there came to be this literature, I think it originated in the 1980s, in which they started worrying about the security of their networks. And so, because they're military guys, they started thinking about it in terms of like terrain, almost, in terms of like space. And so they started thinking of networks as its own space, and they called it cyberspace. And so that's where this term cyber warfare and cyber security comes. It was sort of this militarized version of what was already kind of an established field, right? In security, network security. Well, that's not good enough if you're in the military. You have to call it cyber security in order to refer to cyberspace. It's just goofy. It's like institutional linguistics. But that's what they call it, and so that's what everybody reports it. So that's kind of what you have to refer to it as. But anyway, yeah, they talked a lot about cybersecurity, because that's been in the news a lot. I don't know how much depth there was to that conversation. I don't know that Trump is like a really big policy guy, to put it mildly. So I don't know. I don't know what they talked about, and I don't know what the significance of the length of the talk would be. Again, no shortage of things to talk about, so it doesn't surprise me that they talked a lot. But I don't know what you can really infer about what they talked about or the significance thereof. So that's kind of a wait and see thing. You'll probably find out what they were talking about sooner or later in terms of policy actions in the near future. What do you think of Milton Friedman's economic philosophies? Yeah, Milton Friedman is an economist. If you don't know, Milton Friedman is an economist who sort of made a name for himself in the, I want to say, late 70s, early 80s. And he did so as a what's known as like a Hayekian economist. And a Hayekian economist is basically refers to an earlier political economist named Friedrich Hayek, who was who's like the most famous Austrian school economist. And the Austrian school of economics is very pro free trade, very much emphasizes deregulation and kind of letting markets decide for themselves how to distribute resources. And Milton Friedman was an Austrian economist and the Hayekian economist. Also, they're also known as freshwater economists. But interesting. That's another institutional name type thing. Freshwater economists. They call them that because a lot of Austrian economists kind of find their home at the University of Chicago, which is by the Lake Michigan, a great lake here. So it's freshwater as opposed to saltwater economists who are on like UC Berkeley and sort of Ivy League universities on the East Coast. Those are next to the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, hence saltwater. So Milton Friedman was a famous Austrian school economist. And he really made a name for himself in the late 70s, early 80s, because he really stood up to what was kind of the status quo in economics at that time, which was Keynesian economics, which at that time was under heavy strain by what was called stagflation. And stagflation involved high inflation with low economic growth, and stagnant economic growth, basically. So Keynesian economics suggested that if you have high inflation, then your economy must be doing well, because that high inflation must be driven by growing demand from your overheating economy. And if your economy is doing shitty, well, then that must mean there's a lack of demand and prices are going down. So then in the 70s, of course, you have both. You have high inflation and a shitty economy. So Keynesian economics basically imploded. It couldn't quite process that. And Milton Friedman in the Austrian school kind of stepped in and offered some proposals, and eventually those were kind of taken up over time, and they worked. The 80s was a really good time for the United States economy. It really took off. And somebody a couple weeks ago mentioned the petrodollar, and so I've been kind of reading off and on about that and trying to see what how important that is to the US dollar and all that kind of thing. And as part of that research, I've been reading more about the 70s, and it's really interesting to look at the economy in the 70s and the 80s and see just how much it changed, because not just the United States economy, but all the economies of the developed world were really struggling in the 70s. I mean, Europe and the sort of Western alliance against communism was really at a low point in the 70s. They were really having a rough go. And then in the 80s, they just had this dramatic turnaround. And a lot of that was kind of credited to deregulation, as well as to Paul Volcker, who was head of the Federal Reserve during this period, and he implemented the famous Volcker Rule, which involved no, he did. It's not the Volcker Rule. Rather, what Paul Volcker did was jack up interest rates significantly. And the reason he did that was to fight inflation. Up to that point, the Federal Reserve, which is basically America's central bank, if you don't know, if you're not from the United States, and you don't know what the Federal Reserve is, it's just America's central bank. That's basically what it is. And if somebody wants to talk about the Federal Reserve and how it differs from a central bank, we can talk about that, because that's a pretty fun conversation. But yeah, basically it's just our central bank over here. So he jacked up interest rates in order to focus on inflation. And up to that point, the Federal Reserve had been focusing on just the economy generally. And the idea was we should adjust interest rates in order to act as a counter-cyclical force to balance out overheating in the economy and also downturns in the economy. And so Paul Volcker said, no, let's not focus on the economy, let's just focus narrowly on inflation. And so Paul Volcker in the 80s jacked up interest rates to something like 20 or 30%. It was a lot. Like, if you've been following it, if you know interest rates at all, that's really high. Like it has interest rates in the United States have not been above like 2% in what almost like 30 years now or something like that. They've been hovering, or maybe like 3 to 5%. It's been in that range for like 30 years. And then before that, it had been like closer to 5 to 10% in the 70s. And then Paul Volcker comes in and he's like, boom, interest rate bomb, just 25%. Wow, very high. And that did the trick. It also threw the economy into a recession, but it also dealt with the inflation. And then subsequently, the economy was able to take off. Now, the big deregulatory push in the early 80s was also a part of that. And so this was all basically linked into Milton Friedman, because Friedman was not just like a big deregulation guy. He was also a big monetarist. And monetarism is like a school of economics too. And he's basically like the father of monetarism. In fact, Milton Friedman's most famous work, individual work, I think, was a big book he published, which was a monetary history of the United States. If I'm remembering it correctly, that's like his big contribution. He wrote a lot of articles, I'm sure, but that's like the thing he's most well known for. Economic history, monetary history of the United States. So he's a big monetarist, and his big thing is focus on inflation. Inflation is bad. Printing too much money is bad. Don't do that. So he was kind of part of the force behind that shift in the Federal Reserve that that led them to focus more on inflation rather than just the general economy and economic performance. So that's who Milton Friedman is. So the question is, what do I think of his economic philosophies? I mean, he's a good economist. I mean, he has good ideas. I haven't like read too deeply into his work specifically. If you're asking not so much about his work than about just Austrian economics in general, the trouble with Austrian economics is that it's the Austrian school of economics, I should say, is that it's kind of hard to quantify. And it's hard, like there's been a big, Pact and I were talking about this actually recently. There's been a big revolution in academia, at least in the United States, not so much in Europe, where there's been a big push towards quantification. Instead of having these sort of qualitative approaches to research and having papers published on given topics using mostly qualitative arguments, logic, reasoning, what have you, there's been a shift towards using quantification where you measure things. Whatever it is you're testing or want to do research on, whatever idea it is you're exploring, try to reduce that to something that's measurable so that you can use a model or some other quantifiable type approach so that you can have something very specific to test. So you have a hypothesis and then you can test a quantifiable research question and then have a very clear result. And there are good and bad reasons. If somebody wants to kind of get into that and the reasons why that's happened in academia, we could get into that. But basically, the reason for it was that in order to discipline sort of academia, discipline research, and get it to kind of narrow the field of discourse into something where you could actually draw more conclusions from. The qualitative approach is kind of interesting. I like the qualitative approach myself. That's kind of more the direction I was going in before I blew up my academic career. I think, some people I think were asking about that. What are my credentials? Just to kind of make that clear, I have a bachelor's in economics, a master's in economics, a master's in public affairs, and I was briefly for I think 2 years in a PhD economics program before I transferred and spent a couple of years in the PhD political econ program. And then that's when I dropped out. I was all but dissertation. I'd finished the course requirement and passed the qualifier, but I was all but dissertation, and that's when I dropped out of the political econ program. So 2 masters and a bachelor's and a failed attempt at a PhD. That's where I'm coming from. And that's Friedman's economic philosophies. They're fine. I don't have a problem with them, I guess. I'm sorry, my opinions generally are not very forceful. They don't make for really great conversation. I can talk about them. I can talk about Austrian economics, but it's not. I don't have like a really strong opinion about it. But I mean, to go back to the quantifiable and qualitative thing, it's Austrian school of economics is more of a qualitative approach to economics. And as a result, it's kind of hard to push it in the modern sort of academic environment. More prominent right now is, a lot of different things. It also kind of depends on what kind of economics you're talking about, because there's macroeconomics and microeconomics. And, macroeconomics is kind of its own thing. They mostly do neo-Keynesian policy there. By the way, any of you who have argued for Keynesian policy, just so you know, Keynesianism is pretty much dead. In the economic literature, in the economics discourse, nobody talks about Keynesianism anymore, really. There's neo-Keynesianism, that's a thing, but that's just one of several like theories and schools of thought. So there's not like a big Austrian versus Keynesian battle going on anymore. It's more complicated than that. The field is kind of fractured. But macroeconomics, that's a little more neo-Keynesian. They're a little bit restricted because they still use that model, output equals government spending plus investment plus consumption plus exports minus imports. Their models are a lot more complicated than that these days. In fact, central banks use macroeconomic models, but because that's still kind of their frame of reference, it restricts them a little bit, in my opinion. Microeconomics is a different beast entirely, and a lot of what they do doesn't even require a school of thought. Microeconomics is much more about studying the behavior of individuals and prices and institutions and things like that. And so it doesn't, you can interpret your data in a certain way that's more Austrian or more, I guess, statist, if you want to call it that, whatever your preference is. But because it's more quantitative, because microeconomics lends itself more to quantitative research, you don't really do research according to a school of thought. It's been disciplined into very narrow sort of quantitative type research. So in that sense, it doesn't even really matter. So schools of thought and philosophies like that aren't really like an important thing unless you want to do like philosophy or political economy. If you want to take more of that approach to issues, there's also like cost-benefit analysis, things like policy research. That's actually pretty fun. That's interesting. You can take more of that approach there. You can try to say, okay, we have a policy that is recommended by the Austrian School of Economics. Let's test that policy. Let's try to model what would happen if it were implemented. That's probably about as close as you could come to something that would be considered like Austrian research. So, but I haven't read a whole lot of that. So in that sense, I can't like give you a really sound summary or opinion on that. So I don't know. It's fun to read. It's an interesting perspective. I like it in that sense. Any number of economic theories and perspectives have lots of things to offer in different aspects, ideas, contributions. So, yeah. Again, sorry if that's not like a really great answer. That's probably not what you wanted in terms of like opinion, but that's kind of where I am.
Broad and vague questions, getting the broad and vague answers.
Yeah, yeah, that's one way to put it.
Well, I think we'll probably wrap things up here. Today's stream went over a little bit into the 8-hour 36 range, but I wanted to give Agent Smith some awesome time because he's an awesome guy.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, but today's been really good. Thanks for coming on again. There were a couple more questions, so we request that you save those for next time, and when we have them on Sunday of next week, we can take a crack at that.
Yep, thanks again. Look forward to it.
Cool. Keep it real. Do your thing, and we'll see you next Sunday.
See you next time.
Cool. Nice.